Hey everybody, tonight's video is called The Measurements of Dimension, and tonight we continue our pass-through study in the book of Ezekiel, where we're going to be looking at the measuring of the temple. So we are going to be in chapter 41 in this final section of the book of Ezekiel. And so let's look at Ezekiel 41. We'll start with verse 1 and 2. Then he brought me into the sanctuary and measured the doorposts, 6 cubits wide on one side and 6 cubits wide on the other side. The width of the tabernacle. The width of the entryway was 10 cubits, and the side walls of the entrance were 5 cubits on this side and 5 cubits on the other side. And he measured its length 40 cubits, and its width 20 cubits. So we see precise descriptions continue for the temple proper. Its sanctuary or holy place is called tabernacle, and the side chambers for priest quarters. In this chapter, it can be studied in light of 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 7 to note differences from that of Solomon's temple. And since Ezekiel was a priest himself, he could go into the sanctuary, the holy place, with his radiant guide. Verse 3 and 4. Also he went inside and measured the doorposts, 2 cubits in the entrance, 6 cubits high, and the width of the entrance 7 cubits. He measured the length 20 cubits and the width 20 cubits beyond the sanctuary. And he said to me, "This is the most holy place." So now, access to the most holy place was restricted only to the high priest on the Day of Atonement that we find in the Mosaic Law, the book of Leviticus 16. And as a measure of the restrictive access into the new temple, we see that the angel can enter the room, but Ezekiel cannot, even before the Lord's glory returns to take up residence there, as we'll see coming up in chapter 43 at the end of the week. And these dimensions are identical to Solomon's temple when you look at 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 20, and twice of those of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And in Ezekiel's temple, the most holy place is accessed by openings of increasing narrowness. In verse 5 through 11, it says, "Next he measured the wall of the temple 6 cubits. The width of each side chamber all around the temple was 4 cubits on every side. The side chambers were in 3 stories, one above the other, 30 chambers in each story. They rested on ledges, which were for the side chambers all around, that they might be supported, but not fastened to the wall of the temple. As one went up from story to story, the side chambers became wider all around because of their support and ledges, and the wall of the temple ascended like steps. Therefore, the width of the structure increased as one went up from the lowliest story to the highest by way of the middle one. I also saw an elevation all around the temple. It was the foundation of the side chambers, a full rod, that is 6 cubits high. The thickness of the outer wall was the side chambers was 5 cubits, and so also the remaining terrace by the place of the side chambers of the temple. And between it and the wall, chambers were a width of 20 cubits all around the temple of every side. The door of the side chambers opened on the terrace, one door toward the north and another down toward the south. And the width of the terrace was 5 cubits all around. So we see this section here is describing the wall and the side chambers. And the rooms are built around the northwest and south sides of the temple building. And they were probably used for storing equipment in the wealth of the temple, like seen of Solomon's back in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 5 through 10. And the building to the rear of the temple may simply protect it from unauthorized access. In verse 12, the building that faced the separating courtyard at its western end was 70 cubits wide. The wall of the building was 5 cubits thick all around, and its length 90 cubits. So beyond the western end of the temple proper was a distinct building with space that serves the temple, possibly house and supplies. And the western side of the temple complex had no gate. In verse 13-14, So he measured the temple 100 cubits long, and the separating courtyard with the building and its walls was 100 cubits long. Also, the width of the eastern face of the temple, including the separating courtyard, was 100 cubits. So the measured temple overall was about 175 square feet. Verse 15 through 17, he measured the length of the building behind it, facing the separating courtyard with its galleries on one side and on the other side, 100 cubits, as well as the inner temple and the porches of the court, their doorposts, in the beveled window frames, and the galleries all around their 3 stories opposite the threshold were paneled with wood from the ground to the windows. The windows were covered from the space above the door even to the inner room, as well as the outside, and on every wall all around, inside and outside, by measure. So the galleries were terraced buildings with decorations, and Ezekiel and his guide not only noticed the dimensions, but they also gave the design details of the temple. In verse 18 through 20, and it was made with cherubim and palm trees, a palm tree between cherubim and cherub. Each cherub had 2 faces, so that the face of a man was toward a palm tree on one side, and the face of the young lion toward a palm tree on the other side. Thus it was made throughout the temple all around. From the floor to the space above the door, and on the wall of the sanctuary, cherubim and palm trees were carved. So we see the cherubim like we saw back in the book of, well, Ezekiel here, but chapter 1 and chapter 10, with palms between them, possibly to depict the life and fruitfulness of God's servants, were on the walls of the temple proper and on the doors. And each cherub had the face of a man and of a lion, possibly to represent the humanity and the kingship of the Messiah. And the big difference that we see here compared to Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10 in the book of Revelation is we see that the cherub in Ezekiel's vision here had 2 faces rather than the 4 that's recorded in the others. And verse 21-22 says, the doorposts of the temple were square, as was the front of the sanctuary. Their appearance was similar. The altar was of wood 3 cubits high, and its length 2 cubits. Its corners, its length, and its sides were of wood. And he said to me, this is the table that is before the Lord. So this was the altar of incense that was also seen back in Exodus 30, verse 1 through 3, in 1 Kings 7:48. And the table of the bread of the presence is described as an altar only here, highlighting Ezekiel's focus on the temple as a place of sacrifice. In verse 23 through 26, to finish the chapter, it says the temple and the sanctuary had 2 doors. The doors had 2 panels apiece. 2 folding panels, 2 panels for one door, and 2 panels for the other door. Cherubim and palm trees were carved on the doors of the temple, just as they were carved on the walls. A wooden canopy was on the front end, or the front of the vestibule outside. There were beveled window frames and palm trees on one side, and on the other, on the sides of the vestibule, also on the side chambers of the temple, and on the canopies. So the doors were of some sort of folding construction, having 2 panels, presumably hinged in some way. And theologian John Clark saw that these doors, in his interpretation of Ezekiel's passage of 40 through chapters 40 through 48, he believed that the doors here spoke of the Lord's Supper and baptism. And so to wrap up tonight's study, we look at the temple in general with the dimensions of the sanctuary. And we discuss how the high priest only had access to the most holy place. And I want to go over to the book of Hebrews. We're going to look at chapter 9, verse 11 through 14. It says here, "But Christ came as high priest of the good things to come, with the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God." So we saw in verse 4 how the most holy place in the tabernacle and in Solomon's temple are also perfect cubes, equal in length, width, and height. And so we see that Christ in Hebrews here is the high priest, and that's how he has access to the most holy place, and he sits on the right hand of the Father. Let's go over to Revelation chapter 21, verse 16. Revelation 21, verse 16 says, "The city is laid out as a square, its length is as great as its breadth. And he measured the city with a reed, 12,000 furlongs. Its length, breadth, and height are equal." So we saw in verse 4, as mentioned, about the perfect cubes equal in length, width, and height. In John's revelation, he sees this of the New Jerusalem. In verse 5 through 11 of Ezekiel 42 showed the walls of the temple with their chambers. And verse 12 shows the building to the west of the temple. Verse 13 through 17 shows the temple building as a whole. Verse 18 through 20 shows designs on the temple building. And we mentioned the cherubim faces in the design only having two faces, like the four faces seen in Ezekiel and John's revelation. Let's go over to Revelation chapter 4, verse 7 for one more verse. Revelation 4:7, it says, "The first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature like a calf, the third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle." So, in John's vision, we see that the cherubim, in his perception, had four faces. And so, verse 21 and 22 of Ezekiel 42 moves into showing the table before the Lord. And the chapter ended with the doors of the temple. And that's going to wrap up today's study, and we'll see you next to be announced, as we'll be looking at the chambers for the priests. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless.